Welcome everybody gathered here this evening for an evening of learning and music in honor of the month of Adar. As the Gemara says, Mishanichnas Adar Marbe B'Simcha, that from already the beginning of the month of Adar, we increase in joy. And as it says in Tehillim, Pikudi Hashem Yeshar Misamche Lev, that is through Torah and mitzvahs, one gladdens one's heart. So the Rebbe recommends that everyone adds in learning Torah, the Pikudi Hashem, as well as performing mitzvahs Behidr. And obviously, simcha means literally joy and happiness. And that's through physical things. And that's why we're having tonight an evening of learning and music. And thank you all for coming. For all those gathered online, you can download at learningandmusic.com the study companion, the mimer, which obviously you will need as tonight's shir will be presented. After the shir, please, everybody over here, as well as those gathered online, please be sure to fill out the duch so that we're all able to give the Rebbe Psur Stevis, fill out your name and your mother's name, and it will be read at the Rebbe Zoyel. Tonight's evening is made possible in a big part by Rabbi Yerchmiel and Rivka Leah Jacobson, in honor of the 7th yahrzeit of their dear father, Rebbe Tzal Jacobson, alav shalom, which was today, Zayin Adar, the 7th yahrzeit. May he be a good better for his entire family, and there should only be simchas and all the brachas. Thank you, Zalmi and Sarla Cohen, Yossi and Nechamadina Katz, Mendel and Sarla Pinson, Zalman and Mimi Felig, Yossi and Mrs. Mika Sofer of COL Live. Please give your utmost respect and your attention to Rabbi Kaplan.
Thank you, Menachem, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to spend time learning a mimer together. A number of people asked me why I chose this mimer. So there are 3 reasons. The first is that I thought this would be short enough for us to be able to actually complete a mimer in one sitting. So you have a Dover Shalom. You came, you sat, you'll leave, you'll have downloaded and absorbed an entire mimer of the Rebbe. Number 2, as you learn this mimer, you'll see that although it seems esoteric on the surface, it has extremely practical takeaways. I would like to humbly suggest that if we take this mimer to heart and we spend the next week incorporating the message of the mimer, that Purim will be different. And if Purim will be different, the whole year will be elevated. And lastly, although when it comes to something like a mimer from the Rebbe, none of us really understand what we're talking about. Insofar as Kedusha, holiness is concerned, the transmission of profound and powerful godly messages. A mimer is, as Chassidim know, mimer Har Sinai. There's an element of Shechina medaberes b'terech groinai, that when the Rebbe said a mimer, that there was a higher consciousness and a flow of Torah on an entirely different level. Really, that's a class and a lecture in and of itself. But this particular mimer was most extraordinary. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary mimarim in the entirety of the Rebbe's Nesius. And so before we begin the mimer, to whet your appetite, and also to help you appreciate what we're about to learn, I just want to take an additional moment to share the details of what happened, how this mimer came to be. The year is Tafshin Mem Aleph, corresponding to 1981. Purim falls on Friday. Friday is Erev Shabbos. Purim and Erev Shabbos are always an unusual mix. The Rebbe came out to Mincha on that Friday afternoon, and there was a very small olam, a very small crowd. For those who remember, in those years, the Rebbe would daven Mincha upstairs in the small Beis Medrash. The Beis Medrash was sparsely filled. There's different accounts, maybe 30, perhaps you could stretch it to 40 people were present for Mincha on Purim. Most Bachrim, Jungelite, were on Mivtzoyim. Maybe some people were sitting at their own Purim Sudas still. It was an uneventful Mincha. The Rebbe went back into his room, and a very short while later, just after the crowd had dispersed, and the Vada Masada had picked up the Rebbe's chair and was taking it downstairs for Shabbos, the Rebbe emerged suddenly from his room. In his hand was a bottle of wine, and the Rebbe told Maskiris that the windows should be closed, and as I heard it, the door should be locked. There was certainly less than 30 people, maybe as few as 20 people, when the Rebbe walked into the Beis Medrash to deliver this mimer. And the Rebbe's chair wasn't in its place. So the Rebbe began to wrap the tichel. I'm sure most of you know that before the Rebbe delivered a mimer, he would hold on to a tichel. This was a minig of Rabbi Seinu Nisiyenu, that because of the spirituality and because of the elevating reality of a mimer, that the Rabbeim would actually hold on to something physical. And the Rebbe began to wrap the tichel around his fingers, and he waited till he brought his chair back. The Rebbe's librarian, Rabbi Ber Levin, told me he was present. He was in the Beis Medrash when the Rebbe walked in. He told me he was in such a state of shock. He couldn't comprehend a single word that Rebbe was saying. He said he took a paper out of his pocket and a pen. He said, a mazla had a pen and a paper. And as the Rebbe spoke, I wrote. And that manuscript formed the basis of the Hanocha that was written after. Rabbi Mentlik was present. Rabbi Yael Khan was not present. None of the ordinary, regular chayzrim were there. And between Rabbi Levin and Rabbi Mentlik, and maybe some of the other Bachim and Jungelite in the Beis Medrash at the time, they managed to piece together the mimer. There are conflicting reports on how long the mimer lasted. It seems the mimer lasted for approximately 7 minutes. If we get through this tonight in an hour and a half, we're going to be very lucky. At some point in the mimer, somebody opened one of the windows. And I'm not sure if I get this right, but it seems like the Rebbe interrupted the middle of the mimer and said to Rabbi Klein, "Metach ageret van machen de fenster." So you're talking about a mimer that the maximum, there was 40 people present for. This is not 1952. This is not 1961. This is 1981. Tavshin Mem Aleph. Lubavitch is already very big. There's no recording. There are no pictures. There's obviously no video. And when the Rebbe finished the mimer, he wanted to say L'chaim. Rabbi Mentlik, Alav Shalom, asked the Rebbe if he should bring the Rebbe's becher. The Rebbe said he'll use a plastic cup. The Rebbe said L'chaim on a full cup of wine. The Rebbe instructed whoever was present to say L'chaim. The Rebbe then filled a second glass, had the cup filled a second time and said L'chaim again. And he said, Mizol zogen L'chaim on hagbolos. That people should say L'chaim without limits. And the Rebbe cryptically said, Mizol arain chapen, kol zman ich bin da, av zogen L'chaim. That people should seize the moment for as long as I'm here to say L'chaim. Now, I have to tell you that I was 10 years old in 1981. And I wasn't at the mimer, and I probably wouldn't have remembered it. But I was there Friday night when the Rebbe came down for Kabbalah Shabbos. And it is probably the most memorable Friday night in my life. I'm 10 years old. We lived out of town. I had never seen anything like this. 770 was choderom. It was on wheels. I was a boy, a 10-year-old boy standing on the bima where Kriyas HaTorah took place. I remember the Rebbe walking into show. I can still hear the singing. It was like Simchas Torah night, maybe on steroids. And this mimer had a lot to do with it. You know, I come from Canada. In my country, weed is legal. But I don't believe in getting high that way. There was a time in Canada where not only weed was illegal, even alcohol was illegal. Until today, you can only purchase alcohol at the LCBO, which is a government-run store. And they tell a story that during the Prohibition years, when you weren't allowed to have alcohol at all, a man was hauled in front of the judge for imbibing. And after a long pause, the judge looked at him and he said, "So, you've been brought to court today for drinking." "Great," said the guy. "Let's get started." With no further ado, let us learn a mimer of the Rebbe together. I'm going to suggest that you join me on page 8. The little English sayings that are printed on the outside margin of the page are meant to look at after you learn the ois, not before. It's kind of a poetic encapsulation so that we can quickly review what we learned before we move on. The mimer opens with a quote from Megillah Esther, arguably the most famous pasuk in the entire Megillah. Perek Ches, in chapter 8, verse 16, after describing how Mordechai was dressed in resplendent glory and how the Jewish people were so exalted and elevated, the Megillah goes on to say, La Yehudim ha'yisa'ira v'simcha v'sasein v'yikar. For the Yehudim, for the Jewish people, there was light, there was joy, there was happiness, and beauty. There's much to be said about this verse. In fact, there are a successive series of pages in the Gemara in the first chapter of Maseches Megillah, where the Megillah is expounded. Not every pasuk, but many psukim, in order, from the beginning. Some of it is slightly out of order, most of it is in order. And when Chazal quote this pasuk, they obviously seek elucidation. So what does it mean? What does it mean when the Megillah says, La Yehudim ha'yisa'ira, that there was light? And what does it mean there was simcha, and sasin, and yikar? And why is the Lashon HaKosov? Why does the Nevuah convey to us in this particular fashion? So the Rebbe begins the mimer by quoting from his predecessors. The diyukim that the Rebbe refers to are found in a mimer of the Alter Rebbe from the year Tov Kuf Samach Daled, and it's found in a mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek where he quotes the Alter Rebbe. And the diyuk is from the Alter Rebbe and Mamale Mekeme Acharov, Mahu Lashon Eira. Why, when we speak about light, do we use the word Eira b'teisefes hey? Why do we add a hey? Everybody knows what Eira is light. Even children know that Eira is light. V'reishis bara elikim. In the beginning, the Eibishter created the world, and he said, Vayihi Eir. Eir is the typical word. Eira is non-typical. But since the Megillah specifically adds a hey, there has to be a message for this. So every mimer begins as an opening point by charitably analyzing either a pasuk or a statement of Chazal. And here the Alter Rebbe is analyzing the pasuk, suggesting that there's something being conveyed to us in the added hey. It doesn't say simply Eir. This becomes not easier to understand, but even more difficult to understand when the pasuk is actually explained. That is to say, even if there wasn't a Gemara, and even if Chazal didn't tell us the meaning of the word oira, suppose there was no exposition, suppose there was no greater message conveyed to us. It was just, you would say, euphemism. It's a biblical poetry. It says oir, so it says oira. Even that would present a question to us. It should say, La Yehudim ha'isa oir. Why oira? But the truth is that the Gemara expounds this pasuk. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of oir? What is oir? La Yehudim ha'isa oir. It was light. What do you mean light? What did they have? Were there lanterns? Were there candles being lit? By the way, there is such a pirush. In the Mefarshim on the Megillah, they talk about Lehuda Meisayir. There is this idea that they lit up the chandeliers and everybody lit candles. But the Gemara seems to not be satisfied with that simple meaning. And the Gemara says that Eira Zai Teira. When it says Lehuda Meisayir, it's not speaking about photons. It's not speaking about light. That's a metaphor. It's a euphemism. It means Teira. But the Gemara goes on to say, since when is Torah Ur? Why is Ur Torah? So the Gemara quotes that famous pasuk that comes from Mishlei, from Shlomo HaMelech, in which we say, Ner mitzvah v'Torah Ur. So the Gemara itself proves that Ur and Torah are interchangeable. That there is already precedent, biblical precedent, prophetic precedent, to refer to Eir as Torah. Shlomo HaMelech says, Ner mitzvah Torah is Eir. But this makes the question even bigger. Because it doesn't say Ner mitzvah v'Torah Eira, it says Ner mitzvah v'Torah Eir. So first of all, the language Eira, the hey is superfluous. Secondly, if we actually look in the Gemara, where the Gemara expounds the word Torah Eir, the Gemara is bringing a proof that Eira is Torah because it says Torah Eir. So Ebazei, Tzarech Bir, then we have to understand this. Lama Shina HaKosov Kan. Why, when it came to the pasuk in Megillah, that we have such a shift, such a change? Likrei Torah v'shem Eira. That Torah is called Eira. So now if you take a look on the right, I summed up these few lines by calling it a complexity of light linguistics. The bottom line is we're stuck with a hey. We don't understand what the hey is about. And there has to be some kind of very deep, meaningful message because there's a hey there. Now, the Alter Rebbe, incidentally, is not the first one to ask this question. The question is asked by many of the Mefarshim. In fact, the Maharsha in Chedusha Agadus in the Gemara asks exactly this question. And you'll see that the answer that the Maharsha gives is very similar. The idea of Eira seems naturally to be connected to Simcha. We say, La Yehudim Meisa Eira v'Simcha. And then that's also connected to Sasin and to Yikar. Shenemru la'achareza. And the Rebbe is pointing out that we need to understand this. What is Torah trying to tell us? Now, the next sentence in the mimer is very unusual. It's unusual because up until this point, the Rebbe has analyzed a word in the pasuk, and the Rebbe pointed out that the words that follow have to have some kind of logical or rational connection. But here, the Rebbe begins to speak about something else. Not the details of the pasuk, not the precise way the pasuk is worded, or the specific letters that don't seem to have to be there like a hey. But the Rebbe says, Gam yedua haminag l'sayim pasuk zeh. It's known that there's a famous minhag that we finish this pasuk bibirkas kain tihiyeh lonu. Now the Rebbe here, of course, is referring to Havdalah. The earliest source that I found for the psukim of Hine Kel Yeshuasi being recited prior to Beri Priagofen and the actual Havdalah, which is the bracha that follows both the Beri Priagofen and the Beri Meria'eshen and Bisamim, the earliest source that I found is the Machzor Vitri, which was a Talmud of Rashi. But in Shulchan Aruch, it's not mentioned. The Beis Yosef doesn't mention the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah mentions that it is customary to recite these psukim, and he says it's kind of to induce mazel. We're reading psukim, mazel dike psukim. There is a levush. The levush suggests that each of these psukim speaks either about yayin, or about besamim, or about the oir, and then the question is which order it should or shouldn't have been in. But the Ramah doesn't talk about that at all. The Ramah says you say it for mazel. The Alter Rebbe quotes the Ramah, slightly modifying, adding the word kol, as if to indicate that not only the last pasuk, but all these psukim are recited for the purpose of having mazel during the week. So it seems to me that the Rebbe is pointing two things out here. Number one, of all the psukim in the Megillah, which is the pasuk that is most famous? For sure, this is the part of Purim that accompanies us all year long. Every single Matzah Shabbos, we say goodbye, we bid farewell to Shabbos, and we take on a new week with the words, and yes, it is true, we make a Beirim Eire Ha'esh, but it is not the earliest pasuk that speaks about Eir. In fact, the pasuk of Ner Mitzvah in Torah Ur would seem to be a more natural reference to a torch or a braided candle. But the interesting thing is, not only is this the most famous pasuk in the Megillah, not only is this a pasuk in the Megillah that we recite on a weekly basis, but we actually follow the words with a bracha. So it's not just a mazel thing. It's not just reciting mazel dik psukim. We actually say, Kain tihiyeh lanu. This is like it's like a bracha. We're giving ourselves a bracha. This should happen for us. May it be for us. Shezoi bakasha utfila. The Rebbe here says that from the words Kain tihiyeh lanu, which is not mentioned in the Ramah, and the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention it either. In Shulchan Aruch it doesn't say this. So not only do we mention this pasuk, but we specifically follow the mention of the pasuk with a bracha and a tefillah she'inyanim elu yiyu gam etzleinu. So what is it? What are these things? Clearly, they're very important. They have an influence in a global way on our life as Torah Yidden, because this is what we bless ourselves with. On a weekly basis, we bless ourselves with Eira, Simcha, Sas, and Yikar. It's probably a good idea for us to know what this means, what we're blessing ourselves for, what we're wishing for ourselves, what we're hoping for. What message does the Megillah have for us, which is not Purim-centric, but rather applicable Kol Hashana Kula, and the way the mimer is written, V'tzarech lahavenu inyan b'zeh, we have to understand what this is all about. So I termed it light's evolving effects because ultimately the reason the kind of the pasuk begins, the launching pad of the pasuk is Layehuda Meisa Oida. It seems that everything else follows in succession, a cascade of words after. The literal reason that it's connected to Motzei Shabbos is because of the Havdalah candle. But the whole pasuk seems to comprise a very important part of our Yiddishkeit. And the big question is, what is that? So in order to explain what's going on here, the Rebbe is not going to answer the second questions. He's going to begin first by explaining to us, going back to the first question, which is Oir and Oira. Why is there a hey? Why is it written differently than it's written elsewhere? So in order to understand what's going on here, what this is all about, the hine, the eira, yesh, beis perushim. In the word eira, there are two perushim. And the Rebbe here is quoting from the said mimer, from the mimer in Tovko Samach Daled, and from the mimer that's found in Eira Teira. Peter Shah Aleph, the first answer or interpretation on the word Eira, which is brought in Chassidus, is She'eira hu l'shain nekeva. Hebrew, as you all know, has feminine tense and masculine tense. It's not the only language like that. French, for example, follows the same kind of grammar. But in Hebrew, we know that this is meaningful. It's not just a stylistic thing. It's not just grammar, which doesn't necessarily make any sense in other languages. Those lashonos are what they call heskeni. People agreed to call something a certain word, and therefore the etymology is for the most part irrelevant. It doesn't matter how we got to this word. It doesn't matter why we bothered calling it this word. Whatever, the word is a word. It's like a curio for people who like language to trace the evolution and development of where a language came from, where a word came from, how it got assimilated into the particular language or the use that it's applied today. And as a rule, you should know that languages change. Spoken languages are always in a state of flux. If you go back to the English that's written not even more than 100 years ago, things written or printed in the 1920s read to us as ridiculous. The diction changed, the syntax changed. You know, when I was a kid, a hard drive is when we drove to Niagara Falls. And my children don't even know what a hard drive is anymore because a hard drive means something else. Now they have an iPhone. They're not even using a desktop anymore. A mouse was the kind of thing that people stood in a chair and screamed when they saw. And then a mouse had a different meaning, and now, well, mice have moved on. The point is, spoken languages change, which is incidentally the reason that we didn't speak Hebrew all these years. Ever ask yourself the question? No, people came along and said, we're going to get away from the galut, from the exile Jew. We're going to have a reclamation of the real language of the Jewish people. Really? So all the Chachamim, all the Rishonim, they didn't care about the real Judaism until a few secular people came along in the end of the 19th century, and they were going to reclaim Judaism by reintroducing Hebrew. Guess what? Jewish people, as a rule, did not use Lashon HaKodesh for everyday things. And the reason they didn't use Lashon HaKodesh was because they didn't want it changing. When things are used in everyday speech, when it becomes household words, it changes. We didn't want it to change. Because of this, we have difficulty. That's when we look at the Chumash, when there's a word that shows up once, we have a challenge of understanding what it is, because outside of that one reference in the Chumash, it's not mentioned anywhere else. So Rashi will have to bring you a conjunction of 3 different ideas to prove to you that the word means a certain thing. He'll give you the Mishnaic interpretation of the word, but by the way, Mishnah Hebrew is not exactly the same as a biblical Hebrew, as the Lashon HaKosov. A simple example is the word sheket. Everybody knows what sheket means, right? How do you spell sheket? I was about to say be quiet back there. How do you spell sheket? Shin Kuf Tes. Very good. So you'll presume that the word sheket probably comes from the word shtika, except shtika is spelled shin tuf. So what happened? Where did the test come from? So in all likelihood, the test is Greek influence or Aramaic influence, and it's a perfect example of how spoken words in Hebrew started to change. And the Kuzari has a very interesting piece on this whole thing of language. He says the Chacham was asked a question by the Khazar king. You know, of course, the Kuzari was real, but the Chacham in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's manuscript is not real. He was imagining, if I was the Chacham, what I would have said. He said in the historical fiction of the conversation, the king says, so Avram is an Ivri, eh? And he says, yeah. And he spoke Ivrit, he spoke Hebrew, yeah. He says, so what did he speak before he spoke Hebrew? Just curious. What did he speak was when he was from Aver Hanor? What did he speak before? What did he grow up speaking? And the Chacham says he spoke Aramaic. And he goes on to say that Avraham Avinu spoke Aramaic when he dealt with in Yonei Choil, and he used Lashon HaKodesh only for Divrei Kedusha, which is the reason, for those who know, that at the turn of the last century, the Rebbe Rashab was extremely angry about the use, the co-opting of modern-day Hebrew, of taking Lashon HaKodesh and turning it into an everyday language. And there's a famous story, and if you look in Folakan's stories, he has a story of the Rebbe Rashab meeting with somebody and having a very, very intense argument about it. Now, there are those who will maintain that modern-day Ivrit is not any different than Yiddish. It's a language that's so vastly changed from Lashon HaKodesh that's a conjunction of many words from French, English, Arabic, and beyond, even Yiddish. Like Ani lo mefager, ich vergin nicht. It's like straight Yiddish. The point I'm trying to make is this. The point is that Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, is, as Ramban tells us in his commentary on Aseret HaDibros, is the language that the Eibishter created. It's the language that the Eibishter brought the world into existence with. Vayemer Elikim Yehi Oyer, like the Alter Rebbe explains in Shai Yichud Ve'emunah, that Oyer is the result of when you put the energy of an Aleph and a Vav and a Reish together in that particular order. Then the result is the concept of light or photons as we know it. It's not that different from the scientific definition of water, which is H2O, which is telling you basically it's a code for the chemical composition. So the spiritual composition of Oyer is Aleph Vav Reish. And the spiritual composition of Oira, Aleph Vav Reish Hey, is not just a stylistic thing. It's Lashon Nekeva, Lashon Zachar, Lashon Nekeva. It's a different word. It means something different. It has to mean something different. Because in Lashon HaKodesh, everything is meaningful. And if there is Lashon Zachar that's used, it's because Lashon Zachar brings with it a particular message. And Lashon Nekeva has a particular understanding. So the first explanation, which is, by the way, brought by the Maharsha and is developed by the Tzemach Tzedek and Eira Torah in the name of the Alter Rebbe, is that Eira is Lashon Nekeva. And the question becomes, what is the difference between Eir and Eira? What does it mean Eir is Lashon Zachar and Eira is Lashon Nekeva? It's not because if you're talking about a man, you say this man is Eir, and you talk about a woman, she is Eira. Well, Yehudim Hayasa Eira is not talking about men or women specifically. It's not gender specific. It means Jewish people. If the Jewish people had Oira rather than Oir, then they had something different. If they would have had Oir, they would have had Oir. They got Oira instead. What did they get? So he says it's Lashon Nekeva. What does that mean? So what if it's Lashon Nekeva? How does it describe a different phenomenon? So what is the difference between Zachar and Nekeva if we boil it down to its organic essence, the way Torah describes the difference between Lashon Zachar and Lashon Nekeva? That one likes to go shopping and the other one doesn't? What's the difference between Zachar and Nekeva? We're learning Parshas Truma, we're learning Parshas Tetzaveh, we're learning about the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, it says Isha el Achoisa when it speaks about the Kroshim. The Kroshim were feminine. When we use the terminology of Zachar and Nekeva, it doesn't mean Zachar and Nekeva. Litzela HaMishkan means the side of the Mishkan. And by the way, Tzela doesn't mean a rib. It never did. Chazal are very clear about this in the Gemara. Adam Rishon was an androgynous creature initially. He had a male side and a female side. God peeled off the female side and built a new body. The new and improved version is called Isha. Isha and Isha is not a rib. That's a Christian mistranslation. It has nothing to do with Judaism. What's the difference, the intrinsic difference between Zachar and Nekeva? The answer is, especially in the light of Torah Chassidus, but it's not unique only to Chassidus, is the notion of Mashpia and Mekabel. Because the most profound and pronounced difference between men and women are in the thing that they do that is most important. The most important thing anybody could ever do is build a family. The greatest accomplishment that anybody could ever have the privilege of being part of is bringing children into the world. That's where we're a partner with the Eibishter. As it says, there are Shleisha Shutfim. There are three partners in the creation of a human being. The holiest thing, the greatest thing is a human life. And in the difference between the male contribution and the female contribution, the Zachar is a mashpia, he is a benefactor for a brief moment, And the nekeva develops. She is mikabelas. She receives and develops. And after a tremendous amount of energy and development, a human being emerges. So the basic difference between zachar and nekeva is mashpia or makabel. So if we're talking about oir versus oira, what are we really talking about? Lashon zachar, lashon nekeva. What does it mean? It means that lashon zachar, oir is lashon zachar, that denotes the concept of hash. It's a benefaction. It's something that catalyzes or begins a process. And oira, which is nekeva, refers to receiving, to absorbing, to developing something. In other words, shehu kli lekabel es hashpah. That oira refers not to the giving of light, but oira refers to absorbing light. And that's the meaning of oira lashon nekeva, that we're talking about light. I'm in competition with myself. So the difference between oir would mean the giving of light, and oira would mean the receiving of light. Giving light, receiving light. What does this mean? We'll get to it. The Rebbe will explain. And then there's a very different interpretation, and this is the mimer of the Alter Rebbe in Tovkuf Samach Dalet. Pirish habeis she'oira hu lashon mafil. That oira indicates activity, activating something, to be engaged, engrossed in doing something. It turns it from a noun into a verb. And lashon mafil, k'may me'ira, something which is illuminating, not a source of illumination, but something that is actively illuminating. Shemimeno nimtza metzias ha'or, that or, which is what we call rays of light, or in academics would call it effulgence. Effulgence is the shefa of or, but of course shefa cannot be used for the terminology of or, because shefa means you actually give something. There's an actual benefaction. You need what we call nuclear physics. You're giving something that you can hold on to. And when you give something which is made up of quantum physics, when it leaves your hand and goes into somebody else's hand, it's no longer connected to you. That's the meaning of shefa. I gave a benefaction. If I gave you something, now it's yours. But or never really loses sight of its source. Effulgence is different than benefaction. Effulgence or rays of light are always connected to their source. In fact, when you cover the source, the light suddenly disappears. As we say, or is me'ein hamoir. The rays of light that radiate outward exists within the source or within the luminary before. So oira is not referring to a noun, but oira is referring to Torah not as light, but Torah as lighting, Torah as illuminating. Now these are two very, very different pirushim. They're very different. In fact, they're as different as men and women, Mars and Venus. They're totally different pirushim. One is a pirush that speaks not about the power of giving, but rather about the activity of absorbing. We're not talking about the source of light at all. We're talking about some entity that's receiving the light that's coming from a source. Whereas oira, as lashon mafil, is not only lashon zachar, not only it is a benefaction, it's the full force or profundity of benefaction. It's when benefaction is not a benefactor, but benefaction is actually giving. He's engaged in the giving process. There's a giver, and then there's giving. And giving is dynamic. Whereas a giver, maybe they gave, maybe they'll give again. Stick around, you never know what'll happen. Here it's giving. It's very, very different. These are two very different pirushim. The Rebbe in this mimer, remember the mimer was said in 7 minutes. The Rebbe in this mimer does not discuss either of the two. And I want to point out to you right at the outset that it's very unusual in a mimer to take two totally conflicting different ideas, because typically in the two mimerim that this mimer is built on, one mimer explains Oira as Lashon Nekeva and describes the concept of Yehudim and the union of Bittul, the idea of self-suspension, the idea of self-abnegation, the idea of Jewish humility, which follows actually the Maharsha's description of Oira as Lashon Nekeva. It talks about the Maila of Yidden. It talks not about Torah as God gave Torah. It talks about the Yidden who learn Torah. When it says La Yehudim Hayasa Oira, if it's Lashon Nekeva, it means as Yidden haben sie gefreit mit der Torah, that Yidden appreciated the Torah, that Yidden learned the Torah, that they rallied around the Torah, that they embraced the Torah, that they loved the Torah, that they devoted themselves to Limud HaTorah. That's the meaning of Oira. Oira means we had Torah, we were learning Torah, we were excited about Torah. But when you talk about the concept of Oira Lashon Mafil, it's a totally different concept. So in the mimer, if it's Tzemach Tzedek and Eira Torah, he goes on to describe the Maila of Yidden and Bittul and how Yidden absorb Torah and we become the carriers of light and we absorb light and so on and so forth. And the other mimer of the Alter Rebbe, he speaks about the union of Mafil. He speaks about the power of Torah. He speaks about the influence of Torah. He speaks about the ongoing impact that Torah is making. The Rebbe, in mamish gitzelta asius, in short words, is going to take these two seemingly disparate ideas and show us how they are actually one and the same. The Rebbe takes this idea, and after having described the two shades of light, or the two dimensions of light, Zachar and Nekeva, the Rebbe now shows us how this is really a circle to be completed. You know what a circle is? How do you describe a circle? A circle is a line that somebody put the beginning into the end. It's a mathematical equation. If you take a line, a linear, something which is linear, and you wedge the beginning and the end, you get a circle. That's the meaning of what it says in Sefer Yetzirah, that a circle is na'ot tchilasim b'seifan, that the beginning is wedged in the end. And when the beginning is wedged in the end, at some point, you don't know where it begins or where it ends because it's circular. So circular energy is a continuous thing. The only mashal, the only metaphor we have for infinity is a circle. Because in theory, a circle can continue ad infinitum. I don't know why, but science or mathematics, for some reason, uses the figure 8 instead of a circle. But really, the figure 8 and a circle are the same thing. The point is going round and round and round and round and round. Now, a person in theory can go round and around and around for infinity. It's the only mashal we can have for infinity. But the point of circular, really, Torah shows us ultimately how everything is circular. This is called, in the language of Kabbalah, igulim. There's something called yosher and igulim. The higher worlds are comprised of orbits or igulim rather than yosher, because yosher has a beginning and an end. And if it sounds boring to you, going around the same circle like a gerbil, so then you have to use the idea of a spiral. And when you see a spiral, you're going around the same circle, but you're going, since it's slightly moved, you're going around the same circle, you're going around and around and around, and each time we go around the year, the Alter Rebbe says there's a new light, there's a new energy, there's new inspiration, it's a new year, fresh opportunity, because we're around the same circle. We're coming to Purim yet again, but Purim Tafshin Pei is the kind of Purim that the world has never seen before. And if we prepare, maybe we'll be able to enjoy and appreciate that. So the Rebbe now takes the line and turns it into a circle. And I want to point out to you that this is already a chiddush of the Rebbe prior to this mimer in Tavshim Mem Aleph. It is not discussed in both different ways and taking both very different ideas and making a single circle out of it. When you find the words V'gesh Leimar and a mimer, that means that the Rebbe is saying a chiddush. Many stated. Much of the Rebbe Rashab's Maimarim is a restatement of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimarim. The Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab had the same style of a tremendously detailed explanation. But when you know how to learn Chassidus a little bit, when you hear Aviyesh Leimar, then you know this is what this mimer is coming to add. the Chassidus is being developed. The idea is being further promulgated and pushed forward. The Rebbe is going to now suggest something that was not discussed by the previous Rabbeim. And the premise that the Rebbe told us so many times that if there are two Pirushim in Torah, even if they seem totally opposite, they seem totally contradictory, that they always have to be interdependent and complementary. You just have to figure out how to turn the poles of east and west into a circle. So the kesher is Shalapira Shah Aleph, that according to the first interpretation, the first answer that Eira is Lashon Nekeva, Remezes Teisefes Ha'eis Hey Al Kabbalas Hashpa B'Shleimos. With one letter in the Hebrew alphabet, we have taken a potential recipient and developed them as a successful recipient. In theory, everybody is a recipient. In practice, very few people actually listen to things that are being said. In fact, most people, after they hear something, will assimilate it into their own minds along the lines of things they already heard. They say, that's boring. I heard that already. Well, you really didn't, but you didn't listen. And the less you listen, the less you learn. Like the famous mashal, the kli reikon is machzik. If you have an empty cup, you can fill it with water, coffee, tea, pop, whatever you want. If it's full, you can't fill it with anything else. Most of us are already full. Our minds are full of narishkeit for the most part. And Facebook hasn't helped that. So we have all this narishkeit in our head, and we have all these daigas and all these anxieties, and we're so full of narishkeit that we don't actually make room in our head to hear something new. And because we don't make room in our head to hear something new, we aren't moved by it. How come we learn Chassidus and we're not moved by it? How come we hear our words from the Rebbe and it doesn't lift us? The answer is because we're weighed down, because we didn't make room in our lives to be able to hear the message. The Rebbe once said in a Vav Tishrei Farbrengen that he believed that women could understand Chassidus better than men. And the Rebbe said that's because the women were less involved with the daigas of Parnasa. And the Rebbe said if they're less involved with the daigas of Parnasa, they have less anxiety filling their head, so therefore they have more room for Chassidus. In other words, that in order for somebody to be able to absorb a message that comes from a higher place, I'm not talking about somebody say, hey, there's a fire, watch out. Everybody heard those words. That's very easy to understand. But when words are complex, and when they convey something of profundity, and when the ideas being discussed are not as evident as the physical thing that you're holding in your hand, then you actually have to make room in your mind and your heart and even your soul to listen and absorb it. And if you made room, if you didn't come to a shir or open a sefer saying, I already know everything, but if you know you're learning a mimer from the Rebbe the first time, you're not going to say, I know what I already learned in Chassidus, and therefore, what else is this mimer going to tell me? But instead, when you learn a mimer from the Rebbe, you make yourself empty. This is the way a Yid is supposed to learn Torah. Nafshi ka'afar la'kol tiyeh. When we make ourselves humble, when we do not come with our arms folded with a sense of arrogance and fullness, but rather we come with a sense of humility, and we want to listen, we want to absorb, then we actually learn a lot of new things. And the shleimus of being able to be a real recipient, of being able to absorb a message, is defined with the ois hey. That's the meaning of oira. If it doesn't say oira, you still could be a recipient. Everything is a potential recipient. The question is, can it retain anything? This is also a potential recipient. You can pour water all over this. It won't be retained. It'll spill right off. It's because it's on a slant. And if it was flat, it still wouldn't retain anything. So the shleimus hashpa is not the ability to hear something, but to listen to it and to retain it. And we talk here about excellence in retention. And excellence in retention is indicated by adding the ois hey, because ois hey takes the word or and makes it from lashon zachar, and men are busy giving and have no time to listen to anybody, and makes it feminine. It gives it a receptive quality. It makes it into shleimus hashpa, the kabbalas hashpa b'shleimus. So when have you fully absorbed something? And this is almost like a paradox. When have you fully absorbed something? When you absorb it to the point of saturation. Because if you absorb it, but you quarantine it off to a certain area, if it doesn't saturate you, you haven't absorbed it. Part of you has absorbed some of it. You didn't absorb it. In order for you to absorb it, it has to saturate and permeate your existence. Let me give you a simple example that you can all understand and appreciate from a halacha, which the Rebbe is actually going to reference now. You're allowed to use a sponge on Shabbos. Why not? Because it absorbs. Because the nature of a sponge is that it absorbs absolutely. The entire sponge absorbs it. A person who's like a sponge is a person who absorbs the entire message. Very few of us are like a sponge. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai had one Talmud, or one kind of Talmud, who he called a sponge, who was able to absorb something absolutely. But the thing about the sponge is that when it absorbs it, when it reaches the point of saturation, when you touch the sponge, what happens? You get wet. You get wet too. In other words, whatever was absorbed is also communicated. You become infectious. So when you absorb something to the point that it saturates your being, then you will necessarily be infecting others with it. Infection can be a positive thing. It doesn't have to be connected to coronavirus, just by the way. Joy can be infectious. If you're joyous and happy and jovial, you can create that kind of mood in the people around you. As they say, if you smile, the world smiles with you. Most of the time, it's true. So joy is infectious because the nature of joy is that it saturates. When people are really and truly joyous, what do? Menachem did it in his advertising. He said that tonight might lead to dancing. I remember very vividly the Rebbe in the beginning of Tafshim Memches speaking at a Farbrengen about Simcha. And the Rebbe was speaking about Simcha, that the nature of Simcha is that it is entirely saturating in its nature. That es nimmt durch the Menschen Ganzen, mereshe va'ad ragle. And it was like we all knew that Rebbe was about to stand up and start dancing. And then he did. I remember a chaver of mine, this is in the old days of payphones and Olatera, and the basement in Olatera, the blue basement, many Olateras ago on Troy Avenue. And he was on the payphone talking to his parents in Europe. And he was a big balaspoilus. And he was excitingly telling his parents on Sunday morning, he said, the Rebbe was speaking about Simcha. And the Rebbe said that the Simcha, and we knew the Rebbe was going to stand. The Rebbe stood up. It was like the whole room. I told you it's infectious. It's like the whole 770 knew that Rebbe was talking so much about Simcha that it should be felt ad okiv sheberegel. And then the next thing, the Rebbe was stood up and the Rebbe danced Malekei Masei. It was a murder Merayim Tika Farbrengen. I don't remember which Shabbos it was. It was one of the first Shabbos of the year after Yom Tov. But the point is that the nature of joy is that it's infectious. Joy saturates us. It's much harder to get chassidus to saturate us. It's much harder to have an idea saturate us to the point that we become infectious. But really, if you absorb something fully, you will become toifeach amanas lahatfiach. You'll become so saturated that you become infectious. You're so wet, you make other things wet. And the paradox here is that the ultimate in hashpah, in Kabbalah, is when you become a mashpia. Like, how funny is that? We're talking all about the shleimus of Kabbalah, but if there's a shleimus in Kabbalah, if you receive to the point of saturation, then you're necessarily going to share it with somebody else. It's impossible otherwise. You will necessarily influence others if this becomes a part of you. Not because you're trying to, but because that's the nature of Shleimus HaKabbalah. So that's Oira. That's what Oira means. Oira is light. Oira means we absorb light to the point that we're actually able to infect others with it. Well, the Pirush HaBeis, and according to the second interpretation, Reimes Tesefes Eis Hey, so the additional Hey signifies or represents, is indicative of a Tesefes Ha'er, of a surge in light, shenimshach b'hamashpia, that the mashpia, the benefactor, who is capable of giving, all of a sudden becomes energized. He becomes a more dynamic giver. He's not just giving, he's giving in a much more intense way. This would be like a person who gets inspired from others, and as a result of being inspired begins to give even more. You know what the Gemara says, "Mi talmida yesam mikulam," and in the years, almost 3 decades of having the privilege of teaching other Yidden Torah, I could tell you that I learned the most from teaching, and the most not just from questions that Talmidim and Talmidas ask, not just the questions people ask, but the very nature of being forced to explain something, to bring it down into the most ordinary, mundane, everyday reality, somehow stimulates your mind and gets you thinking and makes you understanding it even better. That's when you become not from you move from being to oira. You become uis noun and you turn into a verb. You become uis a source of inspiration. You become a continuous inspiration. That's oira. So the mashpia, there's a teisefes oira, a surge of fresh light and fresh creativity and fresh inspiration and fresh energy. All right, so the Rebbe so far has described both of these dynamics, and now he takes the two ends and he puts them together. Now he's going to take that linear reality where he described one extreme and the other extreme. He described shleimus hashpah. He described the full potency of hashpah and the full shleimus, the full potential of Kabbalah. And now the Rebbe says, "V'zehu hakesher ben beis hapirushim." This is where the line becomes a circle. Are you at the edge of your seat yet? This should be exciting for you. I'm excited. In order that that which is being conveyed, that which is being given, should reach the recipient, if the teacher was a better teacher, then the students would be better students. If the ones who are supposed to receive and absorb are fully absorbing and receiving to the point of saturation, then this in and of itself is a sign that the giving, that the inspiration, that the provision of the benefaction was done with full intensity. Here's a simple example. There's a member of my community who's a communications expert. That's what he does. They pay him a lot of money to come, famous people, politicians, who are generally pretty mediocre, at least in our country, and they want to be a little more dynamic, and he has you sit in his fancy office, and he tells you what to do to make your message more dynamic, more meaningful, more sellable. He tries to help you become a better communicator. So I sat in on some of his lessons. I got to try to get better at what you do. And he'll show you how a person can say something and nobody even heard them. And somebody could say the same thing, but they can say it with fervor, and they can say it with passion, and they can say it with excitement, and they can say it with clarity, and it's like a different message. Because it's not even the words we use. It's the way the words are being used. It's not what's being said, it's how it's being said. You can say words that will lose your entire crowd. A person could get up and say the profoundest, most poetic thing, but if he mumbles it to himself or looks up at the ceiling and just says something, shaking back and forth because he's extremely uncomfortable and has a lot of stage fright and can't wait until the speech is over, and everybody knows that he can't wait till the speech is over because he's reading his speech as fast as he could, because he can't wait to get all the words out. It could be the Gettysburg Address, you lost the Elam. And the worst thing you could do is these people get up and say, "I'm a very bad speaker, so please bear with me." That's like telling everybody, "Please turn your ears off. I'm going to torture you for 5 minutes." But a person could say virtually nothing. But if he says it in a way that's interesting, if he says something to people that make them stop and want to listen, he's engaging with his crowd. He takes a message and he throws the ball and he waits till somebody catches it. And then he moves on and throws another ball. And he's excited about what he's saying. And he's conveying it with a passion because he's really passionate about the message. What happens to the audience? They also get excited. They also get into it. I once heard from a communications expert who attended a Farbrengen. I was a boy. I was overhearing a conversation. And he said, he feeds off the crowd. That's what he said, analyzing the Rebbe. He said, looking at the Rebbe, he came not to absorb, but I guess to observe. He said he feeds off the crowd. He feeds off the crowd. My Zayda has a cousin. His name is Dr. Bernard Laun. He's probably the biggest cardiologist in the world. You know what a defibrillator is? He invented it. It's a long story how he came to treat the Rebbe. He's Dr. Weiss's teacher. My Zayda had the schus to get through to him. He was at that time on Shmini Atzeres, Tav Shalamet Ches. He was in the Soviet Union. He was brought there by the Soviets to treat the man behind Brezhnev, a man named Suslov, who was the head of the Communist Party. That's where he was. The Russians brought an American doctor in 1977. So he was in a number of conversations that he had with the Rebbe and during the period after Lamed Ches. One of the things that he asked the Rebbe was whether the Rebbe could minimize the Farbrengens, not Farbreng as much. And the Rebbe said, when I Farbreng, I am elevated and my audience is elevated. It's not negotiable. In other words, a Farbrengen was a dynamic event. The Rebbe didn't come and speak. The Rebbe spent time with Chassidim. The Rebbe was ishtapchus hanefesh. The Rebbe poured his soul out with Chassidim. The Rebbe shared his life with us. He shared his Torah with us. He shared his etzem with us. And of course, the communications expert wasn't wrong in knowing that he fed from the crowd, and it's obvious that we were fed by the Rebbe. Because the dynamism of mashpia and mekabel is such that they're not mutually exclusive, but rather interdependent. That there's a circle. Hashpah and Kabbalah is a circle. Where one ends, the other begins, and when the other ends, the first begins. The Rebbe says these two very different ideas of Oir and Oira, of Mashpia and Mekabel, they're not different ideas. It's the same concept. It's two sides of a circle. It's when a Mashpia is bebechinas Eira, when he experiences a surge of creativity, a surge of excitement. When he's filled with greater passion, the result is that the Mekabel is able to receive and be saturated by the message. So Eira means there's more powerful Kabbalah going on. There's Kabbalah to the point of Tefeah Amanas Lahatfiach, which means to the point of saturation. And the reason that the Kabbalah is to the point of Tefeah Amanas Lahatfiach is because Eira is what's going on here. Because there's a surge of new creativity, there's a surge of new energy in the Mashpia himself, and because the Mashpia is giving more, the Mekabel is able to receive. One of the most difficult things that I do is talk on the radio every day for almost 20 years. And I'll tell you why it's difficult. Because I don't have an audience. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to be passionate when you don't have an audience. It took me years to get used to. I've been changing diapers, filling gas. I did all kinds of things while I speak on the radio because whenever they call, I have to stop and speak, and this is what it is. But it really takes time to psych yourself up, to get excited and passionate about something when you don't see who you're talking to. And it's even stranger when sometimes the radio host isn't there to ask her questions, because at least when she asks a question, I'm feeding off somebody. And then someday she won't be there and I just have to start talking. And that took me a really long time to get used to. So I'll tell you a little secret. Like a lot of these videos I do in Chabad Flamingo, they don't exactly have huge crowds. I had to learn how to self-motivate. It's a little like disheartening sometimes when you prepare for like 5, 6, 7 hours to give a shir. and less people show up than the hours you put into it. It's comforting to know that it goes online. Oh, thank you so much. That it goes online and other people will watch and you get nice feedback, but it takes a lot of time to self-motivate, to learn how to get excited when there's nobody to get excited for. Because the nature is that Hashpah and Kabbalah are really not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. That's what the Rebbe is saying here. That's what the Rebbe is saying here. But the Rebbe is framing it in a way where all of a sudden, two biyurim in Chassidus, which up until Tavshim and Malef seem to be talking about totally different dimensions of this concept in Torah, and the Rebbe shows us with utter simplicity that they're actually one and the same. Now the Rebbe does something absolutely unbelievable. Not only did the Rebbe, in a few short minutes, this must have taken, by the way, 60 seconds, maybe a minute and a half for the Rebbe to say. Not only did the Rebbe show us with the profundity of simplicity that the two biyurim in Chassidus are not only not disparate, but actually interdependent and complementary, and in fact one and the same. But the Rebbe now shows us how this idea conveyed to us with the adding of a hey is also not unprecedented. An alta maisa. You think, says the Rebbe, this is the first time that the adding of a hey meant bringing about the completion of the circle, which nobody ever thought of until Tavshim and Malach, till the Rebbe showed us how Eire and Eire is really two sides of one circle. Now the Rebbe shows us that there's a precedent for this. The Yuvan will understand this better. Guess what? The very first mashpia in the world. Who is the first source of global inspiration? Avraham Avinu. I'm once sitting with a Christian faith leader, and he tells me, Rabbi, what is Melchizedek to you? Melchizedek. I said, I beg your pardon? He says, is Melchizedek part of your liturgy? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, Melchizedek. He's part of our liturgy. He's one of our patriarchs. I'm like, I thought you took everything from us. I never heard of this guy. Are you sure? He says, yeah, he was the king of Salem. I go, oh, Melchizedek Melech Shalem. Yes. Yeah, I heard of him, yeah. Of course I heard of him. He goes, so how does he figure in your liturgy? And I said, he doesn't. He doesn't? Wasn't he the king of Salem? Wasn't he the priest of God to whom Abraham came and paid homage? I said, wow, that's a good question. How come Melchizedek doesn't get any attention? And we know his name is not even Melchizedek. He's really Shem. He's Shem. And when Rivka needs to find a Navi and she's afraid to go to her father-in-law to tell him, hey, you know this nice lady your son married? She's off the walls. She has a pregnancy with a Rasha, with a tzaddik, some kind of crazy creature in there. Who did she go to? Rashi says, according to Mechilta, she went to Melchizedek. How come Shem ben Noach is not a big wheel? How come he's not mentioned? So right away, I thought the answer is very simple. The same answer that Chassidus gives, how come Noach is not for us a lodestar? Because Noach had gelebt hunderte Jahre und wie viel Bala Tshuva gemacht? He lived for hundreds of years. The Eibishter gave him a 120-year soapbox. He had him go through multiple crises, midlife crises in life. First, he becomes a worker for the JNF and he starts planting trees. Then he goes into the lumber business. Then he goes into the shipbuilding business. He had all these were opportunities for him to people to come over and say, Noach, have you lost your marbles? No, I actually didn't. Well, why are you planting trees? God told me. Why did God tell you to do it? Oh, you sure you want the answer? It's a long story. There's going to be a big flood. And all the people who do Avedis, whoever heard this guy's nuts. And so Noach preached for 120 years. And Noach's, the name of Noach's single, solitary Baal Tshuva is, do you know the name? Don't try to guess it, because he doesn't have any Baal Tshuva. Your own children are not called your Baal Tshuva. A shliach who goes off to a distant place and raises a beautiful family, but doesn't influence a single Jew living in his place, is not doing his job. Obviously, you have to hold on to your family, and your children have to become an extension of you. But who's in Mekarev? Nobody. That's not for us. A patriarch. I say to this Galach, I said, sir, Who did he influence? He says, I don't know. I said, you know why you don't know? Because he influenced no one. And I said, do you know what we, the Jewish people, are called? A light unto the nations. You know what our job is? We're in the influence business. We're supposed to be shedding light. I said, how could we have a patriarch who influenced nobody? No Malki Tzedek for us. Not even a Misushalach. Who is for us our Avis? Who is our first father? Avraham Avinu. What's Avraham Avinu's most profound impact? Hashpah. Avraham Avinu is about Hashpah. Avraham Git. Avraham Avinu gives so much that in the Sefer Habar, which is the second Sefer of Kabbalah ever written, that for many, many centuries was really, instead of the Zohar, because we don't have the Zohar till it reappeared in Spain in the Middle Ages, it says, the Sefer Habar says that when Avraham Avinu was functioning terrestrially, Chesed Atzilus came and complained to the Eibishter that he no longer has a function. Because Avraham Avinu gave and gave and gave. And yet, despite the fact that Avraham Avinu's essence is giving, in the beginning, Avraham Avinu had a problem. Avraham Avinu's impact, his orbit of influence, was relatively small. Why? What was the issue? The issue was Shebetchila Nikra B'Shem Avram. Because in the beginning it was called Avram. And if words in Hebrew are meaningful, names are meaningful on steroids. What does Avram mean? Av is a father, Ram means a heiche, a lofty, distant father. Avraham Avinu had a problem. It was called ivory tower syndrome. He had his head in the clouds. He was having difficulty getting through to people in a lasting way. And then the Eibishter changed him. The Eibishter added a hey. And what happened when the Eibishter added a hey to Avram's name? V'nikra Avraham. There's the famous beer on this, which is brought down in the early Sifrei Kabbalah and is developed extensively in the writings of Chassidus, that the concept was Shal Yedei Teisefes Ois Hey Nase Avraham Avinu Bechinas Av Hamoin Goyim. The Hey stands for Hamoin. Hamoin means multitudes. Avraham Avinu became a father of multitudes because in the beginning he was a source of inspiration, but he remained distant. And es wird gedenken Tate. A Tate transforms the offspring. Avraham was distant. Ik ben a Tate aber in Himmel. There was a famous Chassidish Yid. His name I'm not going to mention. He was a very, very holy Jew. If ik learn Adam a ganze Tag. And Nebuch, his wife, passed away, and he had a young son, and the son was a wilde Julik, a wild boy. So they said to this wild boy, we'll call him Yankel, they said, Yankel, bist du chazei wild? You're so wild, you're so unkempt, you're so difficult to tame. But as a tate, he said. And he said to them, my mama is in dread, and my tate is in Himmel, and that's why I look like this. Nebuch. Ayosim. His mother wasn't there. She was buried, Nebuch. Yasim. His father was in the heavens. Avraham Avinu was in the heavens. And because he was in the heavens, he couldn't be an Av Hamoin Goyim. He could influence, but he couldn't have a lasting, profound, personal influence. And this is an open pasuk. Avraham. And the pasuk says, why are you going to be Avraham? Ki Av Hamoin Goyim Nesaticha. Because Avraham Avinu has a function in which he needs to father many nations. V'hainu, that is to say that Avram, as I told you, Pirushay Avram, which means a lofty father, as it says in Zohar, and brought down in many places. Shakol, that means Seichel Hanela Mikol Rayam, which this very interestingly is a phrase which is quoted extensively in Chassidus, extensively. In many places of the Alter Rebbe's Amarim and the Rabbeim, and that actually is taken from a liturgical poem, from a piyut of a Talmud Haramak. But Talmidim of the Ramak did not write lyrics. When they wrote spiritual poetry, It was Torah. It was full of meaning. The poetry had to be studied. So he calls Avraham Avinu in this liturgical poem, in this pismon, which is sung in certain communities by Shalosh Shudas. He calls him Seichel Hanela Mikol Rayan. By the way, this shouldn't be news that I'm telling you. If you were learning Chitas last week, when you came across the Krashim, you'll notice that Rashi quotes a famous Paitan. He's not so famous. He's never not well known, and there's a reason for that. His name was Yanai. But Yanai, who wrote many, many piyutim that are not used because he wrote Yitzris L'Shabbos according to the order of reading the Torah every 3 years. So all of his Yitzris for every Shabbos never got anywhere when everybody started on the 1 year cycle. The only Yitzris that we have, some communities recite it on the first day of Pesach. There's a poem, a liturgical poem on Sukkot. And then there's in Hayam Nerayim, we have 3 things from Yanai. I think Ato Elokenu is from Yanai. So Yanai was this amazing genius, a Torah genius. But he was also a tremendously gifted poet. And he distilled Torah secrets into the poetry that he wrote. So here we have poetry, spiritual poetry, brilliant spiritual poetry, Kabbalistic spiritual poetry. It's like learn Azam B'Shvachim. It will take you a few months to learn Azam B'Shvachim properly. It's incredible profundity and depth in Azam B'Shvachim and Asadul Sudas. Lives of nursery school children. That Avram's profundity could be felt, known, and understood and appreciated on every level of the strata of human consciousness. And that means that in order for Avram to get to the lowest common denominator, he needed to have an infusion of inspiration from the highest. You see how unbelievable this is? The Rebbe put together the idea of Oir and Oira and Oira. Which the way it's explained in Chassidus, Oira and Oira are talking about Mizrach Mimayrev, Zachar and Nekeva, Mashpia and Mekabel. The Rebbe said, take the line, pick it up at the 2 ends, and wedge them together and make a circle. Sedach dezel bezach, in order to have Oira, which means receiving to the point of saturation. I have to have a benefaction in the methodology and the image of Oira. Oira equals Oira. Forget EMC equals 2. Oira equals Oira. And where do we find an example? The Rebbe says, Alta Maisa. The Rebbe in his humility says, I didn't say anything. I didn't tell you anything new. This is as old as Judaism itself. This is the story of Avraham Avinu. All I did is just take the story of Avraham Avinu and show you how it works in Oida V'Oida. Oida V'Oida is the story of Avram who becomes Avraham. Same idea. Same idea. And now the Rebbe says that you should know that this notion that there's a difference in the mashpia, which will mean a difference in the mekabel, that a profound benefaction will result in a transformative receiving, that this idea is actually also framed by Torah itself. Now remember, we started off the mimer talking about Oir, la Yehudim, Hoysa, Oira, and what is Oira? Oira is Torah. Oira is Torah. The Gemara says so. How do we know? Ner mitzvah Torah. It's a pasuk in Mishlei. So the Rebbe says this idea that I just told you, that the 2 concepts of Oira are really one and the same. This idea that I then showed you, this notion of adding a hey represents the full gamut or the completion of the circle. This is actually the concept of Torah itself. And the whole Oira is Torah. So the Rebbe showed it us how it's in the addition, the infusion of a hey. The hey makes all the difference. And now the Rebbe shows us how that is the structure of Torah itself. Excuse me. So now that we've concluded the patriarchal paradigm of circular perfection, which started from the circular notion of light that filters into the patriarchal paradigm, which is Avraham Avinu, we'll now see how these waves of wisdom are also framed in exactly the same way. And we'll use a monarch's metaphor, as you will see. The The same concept could also be understood not just with regard to the notion of hashpah and Kabbalah, receiving and giving. The notion which was reflected in the experience, the life and times, the maturation and development of Avraham Avinu, but al derech zeh is found within Torah itself. Shekefi shehi mitzad atzma, harehi nikreis b'shem oir stam. Ner mitzvah v'Torah. So Torah is oir, Torah oir. However, al yedei hamshachas oir elyon b'Torah. Before we talked about a change in the teacher of Torah, before we talked about a change in the giver, the hamashpia, the one who was conveying ideas in Torah. Now the Rebbe says it's not only the person or the individual or entity that is giving a hashpah of Torah, but the Torah itself is like this. Torah organically is called oir. But when there's a hamshacha elyon in Torah, when Torah itself becomes infused with a fresh, transformative, new energy, then it becomes from oir, it turns into Eira, which this is the ultimate explanation of La Yehuda Meis Eira, which Eira is Torah. So far we explained that it's Eira because when a Yid learns Torah, Verteran Eira, and when the Hashpah is given of Torah properly, then the one who's teaching a Torah becomes not Eir but Eira. Zog the Rebbe, the same two levels is within Torah itself. And how do we have Torah which is organically Eir, being modified, being transformed, being engineered so that it turns from oir into oira? How does that happen? You and I, my friends, are the ones who make this happen. That when a Yid serves the Eivishter properly, that not only are we changed by the Torah, but we in turn Yidden change Torah. What does this mean, Yidden change Torah? Not chas v'shalom, take Torah outside of the confines of Torah, chas v'shalom. But a Yid reveals a deeper energy in Torah. A Yid is mamshich, a new level from the Eibishter in Torah. It's interesting to me that the Rebbe mentions this by name, but the truth is that this idea is talked about only twice by the Alter Rebbe and in the same parsha. In two mimerim in Parsha Shlach. And one time the Alter Rebbe quotes it in the name of Mayin HaChochma, and the other time he quotes it in the name of the Pardes, and there's a parenthesis, which I think is from the Tzemach Tzedek, that says, Nusach Acheres Mayin HaTorah. Mayin HaTorah is called a Sefer of Kabbalah from the ages of the Geonim. The Geonim is the period after Siyum Hashas. There's Tanoim who wrote the Mishnah, there's Amoraim, which is the time of the Gemara, and then there's called Rabbanon Savaroi, that was still stitching together and tightening the knots and filling in the caulking. And then when they finished, after Rabbanon Savaroi, the period of the Geonim began. There were many, many Geonim. Some of the famous ones, Reb Hai Goren, Reb Tzemach Goren, Reb Sura Goren, Reb Papa Goren, many Geonim living throughout Eurasia. So at the time of the Geonim, we didn't have the Sefer HaZohar. The Sefer HaZohar was in hiding until it was discovered later. We had the Sefer HaBoyer from Nechunya ben Akana. And at certain point during the pre-Middle Ages, talking now 1,400 years ago, 13, 14 centuries ago. So at that time, during the period of the Geonim, this is called Kabbalah, a sefer of the time of the Geonim. However, our tradition is that the wisdom of Mayin HaChochma is actually from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's direct from Moshe Rabbeinu. And it's telling that the Alter Rebbe quotes it in the name of Mayin HaChochma. And the second time that Tzemach Tzedek is Meir, Nusach Acheres. It's probably in the Pardes. I didn't manage to find it in the Pardes. I didn't work hard enough. But I'm sure it's in the Pardes also. But in Mayin HaChochma, it's clear. And the Rebbe quotes it in the name of Mayin HaChochma, because you're talking mamish, this is Moshe Rabbeinu, right? This is the origin of Torah. Moshe is Moshe Kibel Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu, the Makabel of Torah, is telling you about Torah. And what's he telling you about Torah? Shedavid haya mechaber Torah shalamayla im kutchabrichu. It doesn't mean Moshe Rabbeinu spoke about David HaMelech by name. It means it's a Mosaic idea, and at the certain point when it was redacted as we know it, so David HaMelech is the paradigm. David HaMelech is the agent or the actor. But it's not limited only to David HaMelech. This is something that David HaMelech did. It's something that others did also. David HaMelech did it most exquisitely. Like David HaMelech is the one who compiles or redacts Sefer Tehillim. But unless it says Mizmer LeDavid or LeDavid Mizmer, or it's not necessarily from David HaMelech. In fact, many of the Mizmorim begin with the names coming from somebody else, whether it's Mizmer LaAsaf or Levnei Kerach or Tfil LaMesha v'chuli v'chuli. So at any rate, that it says Shadavid haYimechaber Teira Shalamaylim Kutchabrichu. That there's this idea, there's the Torah as we have it. The Torah as it was given to us. The Torah as we can learn and understand it. The Torah as it appears in its finite number of characters and letters. The Tanakh as we have it, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh as we have it. And then David HaMelech is connecting the Torah to its origin, to its source. Hainu shepo'al yichud kutchabrichu imoiraisa. That David HaMelech was able to proverbially link Torah to its source. And when Torah was linked to its source, then the Torah all of a sudden can be in a state of flux. The Alter Rebbe gives a metaphor for this. He says, we know that Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak and Yaakov were Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kula. That's what it says. But what does that mean, though, Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kula? Yes, we know that Avraham Avinu had guests and he served them matzah. Why was he eating matzah? Because it was Pesach. How could that be? There was no Bnei Yisrael. There was certainly no Golus Mitzrayim, and there was certainly no concept. So what do you think Avraham Avinu knew? He knew that his children are going to be in Golus Mitzrayim, and he knew exactly how that's going to work out, and there's going to be matzah on their backs. Avraham Avinu knew b'derech nevuah about certain ideas, and he was mamshech hamshachas. So the hamshacha that we're mamshech through matzah, Avraham Avinu was mamshech through matzah. This was obviously a very important part of Avraham's life, because even Lot, who's the original secular Jew, is serving his guests matzah too. By the way, Lot was serving his guests not just matzah, but he mainly served his guests wine. Yeah, because the first time the word mishta shows up in the Torah is by Lot, not by Avram. By Avram Avinu it says v'ekcha pas lechem. He gave them some bread to eat. But by Lot, he said he invited them to a mishta. And Rabbeinu Bechaya and others say that a mishta is always with yayin. And some of the Rishonim say that he was shoshan hoya. Ikvar shikir. And he was serving them wine. By the way, this is really just to wake everybody up. Some of you look like you're sleeping. Do you know when the story with Lot happened? You know when that was? What date of the calendar? No, it wasn't Pesach, because Avraham Avinu had them for lunch on Pesach. So when they got to lunch, it was Pesach. But not the first night it was. It was the second night of Pesach, or the second day of Pesach. Do you know which other meal, very famous meal, happens on the second day of Pesach? Yeah, Esther Amalka. So the first time, the first mishta, the first meal, it says, Vayavai HaMelech v'Haman la mishta asher asasa Esther. However, the second mishta, when Haman shows up miserable from his daughter who just committed suicide, stinking because he got garbage or worse thrown on him, and he didn't have a chance to take a shower, and he's really depressed and can't wait to drink, put himself in a better mood, and Achashverosh is miserable because he made his best friend miserable. It says, Vayavai HaMelech v'Haman it doesn't say it says im elamishta im Esther. It says im Esther. And the Rishonim say that Esther drank some wine too this time. Very carefully. But she didn't have to drink the same bottle. She had women's wine. She gave them men's wine. These chevra didn't share their wine very well anyway, so okay. Doesn't mean yain nesa. It just means she partook of wine very carefully. Mamaloy says very carefully. She had to know what she was doing. It's now 9:50. Wow. We have a problem? I think he's telling me why you're falling asleep, why I have to tell you Baba Mises. Okay, anyway. I just thought it was really interesting that the first time it mentions Mishta in the Torah is Tes Zayin Nisan, and the second time it says Mishta in the Torah is also Tes Zayin Nisan. And the only Mishta that we actually have to commemorate, so Din Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tafresh Sadik, it says that we have to commemorate the Mishta of Esther Amalka on the second day of Yom Tov. To commemorate, it doesn't just say that Haman got hung. The end of the sif is Haman got hung. It says the Mishta, specifically the Mishta. It's not interesting. Anyway, so going back to this point, the Alter Rebbe says that we see Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov doing mitzvahs. How did Yaakov put on tefillin? There's parchments in tefillin. The tefillin have parchments. The tefillin show up in Parshas Boi. By the way, there was 4 compartments in Parshas Boi, and 2 of them were empty until the end of the 40 years, because 2 of the Parshias are only in Chumash Devarim. Chumash Devarim only get articulated by Moshe in the last 6 weeks of his life. So what was in the Jewish people's batim for the first 40 years? Nothing. Wait, wearing empty tefillin? 2 parshias. And if you look in Rashi, Rashi says that Teitafis means 4 compartments. But in Chumash Devarim, he doesn't say 4 compartments. Because in Chumash Devarim, they actually had not just compartments, but they actually had parshias. So the Jewish people, for the first 39 years, put on tefillin, which in today's day and age would be absolutely puzzle. But for them, it was kosher. It says Misushelach was not a patriarch, but a tzaddik. He was a shoemaker. And the Medrash says that every time he would sew his shoes together, he was miyachid yichudim. So should I be a shoemaker? Should we start sewing shoes and be miyachid yichudim? No, your job is put on tefillin and light Shabbos candles and put up a mezuzah and follow the halacha exactly like the halacha says. However, from the fact that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yankov from the Avis and Imois and Shvatim were Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kula, which doesn't mean they did. It doesn't say Asu as Kol HaTorah. It says they were Mekayim, they fulfilled, they sustained, they bolstered. Because it doesn't say they did. They couldn't have done all the mitzvahs. They fulfilled mitzvahs. What were they doing if they weren't doing the actual mitzvahs? They were doing things which were in the image of a mitzvah. They were connecting to the Etzem HaTorah. The Etzem HaTorah before it was distilled into the Bereshis Bar Elokim that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down in the few days before Matan Torah from Bereshis up to Har Sinai. So that means there's a part of Torah which is transcendent of Chamishi Chumsha Torah. There's a part of Torah which is deeper than Tanakh. A part of Torah which is deeper than the Gemara and the Mechilta and the Medrash as we have it. What part of Torah is that? That's called Etzem HaTorah. Avraham Avinu, B'derech Nevuah, Yitzchak, Yankov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah were connected. They were online. They were connected to the iCloud of Torah. They were downloading from the source. And then Matan Torah comes, and now you can't do your own thing. So Avraham, Moshe Rabbeinu's mother, marries his father, even though the union of Moshe Rabbeinu's father and mother is Asr min HaTorah. Because Moshe Rabbeinu, whose father Amram, married Yocheved, who's his aunt, which is Asr al pi Torah. So how did that happen? So there's a famous beer from the Rebbe about this. Al pi Kabbalah represents a very high level of union, which is not shaykh for 99.999.99999% of the population that will live for the course of 5,000 years. But Amram could do it. But there was no Torah yet. And because there was no prohibition of Torah yet, Amram and Yocheved did what they knew to be true on the madrega that they were in Etzem HaTorah. This is similar, but not the same, but similar to the notion that wool and linen is absolutely forbidden. But in this week's Parsha, if you were reading Chumash carefully, you found out that the Kohen Gadol's clothing was wool and linen. And even the Kohen Hedjet would not, Bizman shebigdeim aleim kuhunosam aleim, to animate and activate the kahuna. What do they need to have on? The avnate. And the avnate, the belt, is made of wool and linen. What's going on over here? I'm not allowed to wear wool and linen. The Kohen Gadol is wearing wool and linen. The answer is that when he's in the Beis HaMikdash, he's existing in a higher space. And in a higher space, there it's possible to make a union of wool and linen, which represents Cain and Hevel, sheep and linen, sheep and flax, aganza maisa. But this is a union which is impossible for us to engage in. Why? Because it's related to Etzem HaTorah. We are within the confines of halacha. But there is a deeper truism in Torah, which is called Etzem HaTorah. And David HaMelech, through his learning of Torah, was able to be mechaber the Torah as we have it with Etzem HaTorah. Don't try that at home. But the point is this. The point is it's possible for the greatest tzaddikim and neviim to be mamshech into Torah, a part of Torah which actually isn't evident in the Torah as we have it. Because they're connecting the Torah as we have it to Etzem HaTorah. Hine al yedei HaTorah nasam shachal lamata be'efen sheperetzes hagdorim. When you're mamshech in the union of Torah that comes from a higher place, it's able to break down the borders. Which borders are we talking about, by the way? Which confines are we talking about? Which confines? The confines of halacha. There's something called Eis Lasis Lashem Mefeiru Teresecha. Shimon HaTzadik is a Kohen Gadol. He puts on the levushim of the Kohen Gadol. He goes outside of Yerushalayim. He walks all night, as the Gemara tells us, until he meets Alexandros Moikdain, Alexander of Macedonia, who at the young age of 29 already conquered the whole world and now is marching on Yerushalayim. And the Tzedukim with the Baisusim told him that the Beis HaMikdash is the source of all your problems. If only you destroyed that place, everything else is downhill. And Shimon HaTzadik goes for a long walk outside the Beis HaMikdash wearing big day kahuna, which means that he's wearing shatnez. How do you do that? How do you do that? He darshan the pasuk Eis Lasses La Hashem Hefeiru Teirosecha. The Gemara in Brachas darshans it two ways, but you have to be Shimon HaTzadik to do that. You can't decide on your own, Rachmana litzlan, to be Mekarev the Torah to Yidden. Instead of being Mekarev Yidden to Torah, as the Rebbe famously sent somebody packing because he wanted to be Mekarev the Torah to Yidden. Instead of Yidden to Torah, the Rebbe said, I can't tell you what to do, but my chassid you won't be. And that was the end of that. He would come to Fabrengen and he would stand with his cup. The Rebbe didn't say l'chaim to him. Why? Because the Shulchan Aruch for us is an absolute. You have to be Shimon HaTzadik to know that Eis Las Hashem Efeiru Teirosecha. You have to be Eliyahu Hanavi to know that you could be Makar of a Korban and Hara Carmel in Haifa instead of Yerushalayim and Hara Bayis. But there's an inyan of Etzem HaTorah here. And when Etzem HaTorah is Nimshach Lamata Mata B'Yesrad La'ilam Haza HaTachten, then what happens as a result of it? Then that's how we make the Didali is Baruch B'Tachtenim. So the Rebbe is talking about something literal and figurative at the same time. And he says that the idea of Torah, the ultimate essence of Torah, is Torah being brought down to the most common, lowest, everyday denominator. The Torah has to change our lives. The Torah has to saturate and change us. But in order for the Torah to fully saturate and change us, you need to have a David HaMelech who's Mechaber Torah too. Etzem HaTorah. And when you're mamshech etzem haTorah, then the Torah as we have it can transform the world as we know it. So in other words, this circle, which started off with oira and oira, which is really one circle, not two different ideas, which is also evident in the concept that hay already has been used to make a transformation by creating a greater infusion, to bring about a greater transformation, that this idea also plays itself within the framework of Torah itself. Now, it's probably 10 o'clock at night, but we have to finish this, because this, my dear friends, is one of the most amazing things ever. The Rebbe is going to say something, b'derech efsher. It's very rare that Rebbe did this. The Rebbe said, as if, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me. It seems to me. There are many mimerim where the Rebbe says v'yesh leimar. Most mimerim, the Rebbe says v'yesh leimar. The Rebbe is adding something in a mimer. Here the Rebbe is telling us an unbelievable chiddush. And this little mimer that the Rebbe came out, to me it seems on that moment the Rebbe had like what you would call the equivalent of a nevuah. He had to come out and say the mimer. It was Erev Shabbos. The Rebbe didn't want to disturb. He said, close the windows, lock the doors. There'll be 20 people there. The Rebbe knew Rebbe Yale wasn't there. The Rebbe knew the Chayzer, the Rebbe knew somehow somebody would be able to record this mimer. The Rebbe had to get this out. It couldn't wait another moment. The Rebbe had to get it out right then. There was a Fabrengen the next day. Friday, the Rebbe comes out with a bottle of wine. That his chair is not there. Or that was on mimer. And the Rebbe says something, b'derech efsher. And my dear friends, if this doesn't knock your socks off, I'm not sure what will. That this is an incredible chiddush that should be life transformative. This should change your life. You should leave here tonight changed. Since I learned this mimer, I have not enough, but come a little bit changed. You know, there's a famous story. It's in a Mugadik mimer from the Rebbe, the Chasna mimer, where the Frierdiker Rebbe comes home and tells the Rebbe Rashab about a mimer he repeated, a mimer of the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab stops him and he said, I said that b'derech efsher. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says back to his father, was is by eich b'derech efsher is by uns b'derech memela. If the Rebbe is derech efsher, and the Rebbe was magia this is in a Mugadik mimer, Chodei di Tafshin Yudalit and other places. Yeshleim ar b'derech efsher. So the Rebbe now is going to suggest, till now all we talked about is the first word, which is oira. Now the Rebbe says b'derech efsher zeh masher kosev la Yehudim ma'isa oira v'simcha. Why? Why is oira followed by simcha? Please, if you haven't been listening till now, just listen to this part. This is unbelievable. Lefisha bechinas eira, because the level, the dimension we call eira, as the Rebbe explained in this mimer. Hainu, namely, hamshachas eir elyin beteira. the profusion of novelty, of a new powerful light in Torah. That this new energy of Torah, that Torah should be transformed because of a new infusion of energy, a new infusion of Torah into Torah from the source of Torah. Be'efen, in a way that it's paid its kol hagdorim, that it could transform the confines of reality as we know it. The Rebbe says that if you want to bring forth a new level in Torah, you want to be David HaMelech, you want to be Mamshich and Eid Elyon, you want to connect the Torah as we know it with a higher level, with the source of Torah, you want to be Paiditz Gedorim, you want to transform the world, you want to change your life, then the Eifen is by serving the Eibishter with Simcha. In other words, when we serve the Eibishter with Simcha, the nature of joy is that it causes a breakdown of rule, rhyme, law, and order. As the famous mimer that the Rebbe Rashab said in Tafresh Nun Zayin Samach Tesamach the Hemshech, where he describes a person who is very much limited by his nature, and the Simchas Chasanas B'nai, suddenly he breaks out of that nature entirely. The Rebbe Rashab goes on to explain that a person whose nature is shy and reserved and uncomfortable giving air or raising his voice, suddenly the moment of simcha, there's a transformation. Sepes nit derselbe Mensch. Where does this guy come from? The answer is it was always him. The Rebbe Rashab said the simcha broke down together. There was an uncomfortability. There were these inhibitions that were blocking his core, his essence. He didn't become somebody else. Simcha is not a drug. It doesn't take over your mind to make you into a crazy person. Simcha is a gilui. It's megala who you really are. But this could be a part of you never knew. But it was only when you experienced true joy that suddenly you discovered that you are a much more amazing person than you ever imagined. Because simcha revealed your potential, your latent ability. That's the meaning of simcha's peretz kol hagdorim. As the Rebbe Rashab explains in the Hemshech Nun Zayin Samach Tesamach, that it actually changes a person, not in theory, but in fact. The Rebbe says we're not talking about some lofty level of simcha, but as Menachem said in the beginning, that this talks about pashet, kipshute, actual music and physical hamantashen. I don't know if he's serving meat tonight, but it's not exactly Yom Tov. The yin of meyadim l'simcha. The meyadim l'simcha is beyayin. Ubasar. By the way, the machlekes poskim, if you have to eat meat, the conclusion of most poskim is that you have to eat meat at the Suda of Purim. Ukemaimer ein simcha ella bebasar. Ve'ein simcha ella beyayin. Hainu yayin ubasar gashmi. Kimavur b'kavim mekemis. In other words, the Rebbe is telling us that it's possible for us to accomplish things like David HaMelech was mikasher etzem HaTorah to Torah as we know it. That it's possible for us to, so to speak, inspire, rouse, or connect to the deepest levels of divinity. But how can we do that? By being besimcha. Poshet kipshute. In Bosa v'yayin. The Rebbe is telling us on this day of Purim, Tov Shem Aleph, that the most powerful thing in the world that a Jew can do to change reality, not on earth, but change reality on heaven. Because the vart is like, Huda Mesa Eira. How could there be Eira? Al Yedei through what? Simcha. Eira, this Simcha, it's as if it says Eira Al Yedei Simcha. The concept of Eira, which means a transformed benefaction, which results in a totally different kind of receipt, that the mashpia is giving in a whole different way, and the mekabel is now absorbing to the point of saturation and inspiration for others. How does it happen? We're actually able to influence the Eibishter. In simple words, you want to make a miracle? You could make a miracle. You could be mamshich like Yehi Ratzon. A new thing, not just bracha v'hamshacha. Yehi ratzon, like it says in Chassidus. You could be mamsha to create something new, a new hamshpa. You could bring about something which is paid as gedarim. What do you have to do? Daven for 15 hours? Fast for a month? Be besimcha. Pashit begashmias. That you have to, not simcha shel heilos, a simcha of Torah. A simcha of Torah, but the simcha has to filter down into the basar v'yayin of Yom Tov. That when a yid rejoices in the opportunities that the Eibishter gives him or her, that when you find simcha in the mitzvahs that the Eibishter gave you, that when Yismach Yisrael be'esav, which as in the 12 psukim finishes off at the court of Tanya, that's Pirush, Shekol Mishahu Mizera Yisrael Yesh Leilismeach, that we should all be joyous. With what should we be joyous? B'simchas Hashem asher sos v'sameach b'dirase b'tachtenim. That the next time you get in a bad mood, stop, think, and remember that the Eibishter has nachas when you are doing a mitzvah right now, right here. It makes a transformation. It brings joy to the Melech Malchei Amlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That you bring joy to the Eibishter. If it brings the Eibishter joy, it should bring you joy. When you find joy in life, when you go through life joyously instead of morosely, happily instead of depressedly, when you do that, you actually bring about a transformational Maila. The Rebbe says this b'derech efshar, by the way, because this is an unbelievable chiddush. This is nuclear. This is telling us that if you will be besimcha now, you literally can change everything. Now, I was talking to the people on Shabbos. I said, so many people are anxious with this coronavirus. If you ask people, what's in the world today? What's the dominant emotion? I would say it's anxiety, fear, worry. What is the Eibishter telling us to do now? B'chlala yid us to be besimcha all year long. And now the Eibishter is telling us it's not good enough to be besimcha. Now we have to be marbim besimcha. That's the call of the hour. That's what the Eibishter says in the Shulchan Aruch. Do you understand what the Rebbe is saying? The Rebbe says, b'derech efshar, that if we would only listen and be besimcha, serve the Eibishter besimcha, you literally can melt down all of the hagbolas, all of the limitations, all of the things that inhibit and obscure, all of the things that obstruct and disable, all of the problems we have can melt away with a hamshacha, with a surge of getlichkeit that's brought about through simcha. Simcha. Pashat simcha. By the way, we only like halfway through the mimer that the Rebbe said in 7 minutes. But this is the biggest chiddush of the mimer. This is an unbelievable chiddush of the mimer. And this is what made me so excited to learn this mimer. I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. The Rebbe just gave us the recipe. He just gave us the strategy. He just gave us the secret to changing the whole world. This is the idea. Sisu v'simcha b'simchas ha'geula, hine Mashiach ba. What do you think it means? That a yid finds joy in the fact that he knows that Mashiach is coming. That in and of itself brings the geula. The Rebbe said multiple times, the story of a Pelish tzaddik was a child. He wanted an apple. His father didn't want to give him an apple. So what did he do? He made a bracha. The Rebbe said that al derech zeh, we have to be sameach b'simchas ha'geula, because when we will be sameach b'simchas ha'geula as otot kumt Mashiach, that kaviyachol forces God's hand. Because if we're already rejoicing with simchas ha'geula, then the Eibishter has to bring us the geula. This is an unbelievable message that the Rebbe delivered in the tiny little beis medrash upstairs with closed windows and closed doors before a handful of people. And I ask you, for who? For who, if not for us? For when, if not for right now? And maybe someday Menachem will be kind enough to reinvite me to finish teaching the mimer. Gute Nacht.
Hashem Elokeinu. Elamodecho polecho, na'adecho al b'nei. Dinei am Hashem Elokeinu. You'll never make the kind of know, I'll let you know. I'll say your name, the kind of day. Hashem Matmo Sebeino, Lavodecho, Sebeino Vapoikecha, Sidecho, Ranedo, Benismecho, All Yameino. Marto, eternity before, we are so Marto, eternity before. Tapti, yes, I hope you're so high on my shed. No, you're so with me. To it, the baby, the box, some tea, yes, I got the foil high on my shed. Love you so with me, We heard today the wonderful mimer from the Shliach of the Rebbe. It was so beautiful, but we're asking Hashem, Eino doime Hashemei amiti shaliach, lishmoi amiti amelech, ritzeneinu lirois es malkeinu. Vayagid Moshe esti Ibrahim Hashem Vayagid Moshe esti Ibrahim Hashem Shuvo Al Davar Hazeh Shomati Mehem Shuvo Al Davar Hazeh Shomati Mehem Al Davar Hazeh Shomati Mehem Shiretzu Oinom Lishmoya Shmoya Mimecha Ay Lishmoya Shamati Me'eh Retoineinu lidois, retoineinu lidois, 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 es malkeinu. Retoineinu lidois, retoineinu lidois, 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 es malkeinu. Retoineinu lidois, retoineinu lidois, 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 es malkeinu. Retoineinu lidois, retoineinu lidois, 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 es malkeinu. Vayagid Moshe, Vayagid Moishe, estibre yavo, El Hashem.
Vayagid Moishe, Moishe, as the prayer El Hashem. Oh, yo,
Something, Baby, now,